Welcome. We're here today with Jesse Fullenkamp, who is the Director of Education and Evaluation at the Ruth Ellis Center in Detroit, Michigan. So welcome, Jesse.
Thank you.
If you could just begin by telling us a bit about what you do at the Ruth Ellis Center and what your social work practice looks like in general.
Yeah. So the Ruth Ellis Center's mission is to provide short and long-term residential safe space and support services to runaway, homeless, and at-risk youth who identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning. And my role there is to focus on internal and external education, meaning that we're supporting curriculum development and doing training with professionals to encourage them to be strategic in how they're serving young people in systems of care, not just at the Ruth Ellis Center, but within other communities as well. So this includes juvenile justice, community mental health, child welfare, which includes child protection services, foster care. And then we also do evaluation work. So we do program evaluation on a variety of services and programs that we have at the Ruth Ellis Center. And we also do some evaluation work with other agencies related to technical assistance and looking at what's working and what isn't working when trying to increase safety and positive health outcomes with LGBTQ youth.
So the Ruth Ellis Center is doing an awful lot of social work practice at varying levels. Sounds like there's a lot of work around policy, interpersonal work with youth. Where does your specific practice factor into the various activities that are going on at Ruth Ellis?
Yes, so our goal is to really work with all of the amazing social workers that are at the Ruth Ellis Center to be learning from the work that they're doing on the ground. And before I was doing education and evaluation work at the Ruth Ellis Center, I was providing services through community mental health and helping develop our Medicaid billable, individual, and family counseling services, as well as looking at strategies to engage youth who are experiencing barriers to housing and getting them linked into services. So in terms of our role, we are really trying to make sure that we're not creating extra work for social workers on the ground, that we are connecting in ways that are a good fit for everyone involved. So when we do education and evaluation work, we're often joining case conferencing sessions that are already happening to start to learn about what services are being delivered, and then really hearing from people on the ground about what is working and where does there seem to be a gap in our knowledge in the field of social work about how to approach this work. And because we serve a very specific community at the Ruth Ellis Center, historically and currently there's a huge lack of research specific to LGBTQ youth, especially LGBTQ youth of color, who are experiencing homelessness, who maybe are in systems of care, and so are not living necessarily with their birth families. So there's a lot of questions that we have about how to do this work, how to do it well, and the work is too important to defer to research that we know is not specific to the youth that we serve at Ruth Ellis Center.
So it sounds like a lot of your practice is very reflective. You're listening to the voices of the people that you work with, but you've also made reference to kind of surveying the academic literature and identifying where gaps are. And so in this course, we're training students to kind of access the academic literature, make appraisals, and then integrate it into their practice as kind of this overall broad framework of evidence-based practice. And so I'm wondering if you consider yourself to be an evidence-based practitioner and what that would mean for you in the work that you do.
Right. Well, as a graduate of University of Michigan School of Social Work, of course I consider myself an evidence-based practitioner. And I consider myself a person who is committed to contributing to evidence-based practice, and that is a part of what we're doing through education and evaluation at the Ruth Ellis Center, because there hasn't been a lot of funding dedicated toward research specific to the community that we serve at the Ruth Ellis Center, and so we have to do it ourselves. And I think that we work with universities. We work with the University of Maryland, University of Michigan, and other entities to really have access to resources to do evaluation and research, but at the end of the day, the information that's most vital, that is going to inform practice, that will be most beneficial to the young people we serve, comes from the young people themselves. And so we have some participatory research that we're doing on site. We have ways that we integrate storytelling and personal experiences and surveying from the young people and translate that into practice. And more recently, we've been working more with families of LGBTQ children to have a better understanding of how to integrate family work in more meaningful ways. So that's a huge part of our commitment to how to do the work and how we do it well. We also have just some really simple things that we do to continue surveying any new research that's coming out. So we are part of a couple of national technical assistant groups or national groups that are committed to serving youth in a variety of capacities who are asking this question of how do we do a better job at serving out-of-home LGBTQ youth, because there is a clear awareness nationally that we don't have the answers, and that because these young people are disproportionately represented in all of these systems of care, that we need to do better, and we need to go back and go deeper and look at the mistakes that we're making and how to really do a better job at creating catered services that meet people where they are. And so when we work with those national groups, everyone's doing literature reviews, they're sharing ideas. And at first, I was really intimidated by all of that. Coming from the Ruth Ellis Center, we're a smaller nonprofit. We, when I first started at the agency, I would have days where I would go to these kind of really intense research meetings, and then it was also my job at the end of the day to help clean the toilets and take out the trash. So, initially it almost felt like an intimidating space to try to enter, being on the ground and doing really kind of grassroots social work. But what we realized is that because we were doing this work on the ground and because we really had found ways to integrate youth voice into the work that we were doing, that we understood components of how to be successful in the work that people who are at universities didn't have their hands on, that they couldn't necessarily wrap their minds around. And so it's not that researchers and folks at universities are not brilliant and don't have great capacity to do that kind of work, but also you have to be connected and working with folks on the ground to make sure that those connections are being made to ultimately serve the folks that you're hoping to serve and to really arrive at goals that are defined by the community that that you're working with. So
yeah, so a core component of evidence-based practice is to take the research, but then apply it in kind of light of client preferences or cultural context. So could you speak to an example of where you thought you might have found some great research, but then upon application felt that there was some disconnect or potential challenges with the population you were working with?
Every day, yes. So I think that I can speak to one example that is really interesting to me because it is an area of work that I think a lot of social service agencies engage in, an area of work that we've all experienced a lot of frustration or failure around, which is kind of, some people call it employment coaching or kind of occupational assistance or employment readiness. And so at the Ruth Ellis Center, we initially would refer out young people to agencies who specialized in employment readiness, who do great work. And what we were finding is that the young people at the Ruth Ellis Center were either being asked to leave those programs because they weren't able to meet the requirements or follow some of the behavioral directives and expectations of those programs, or they weren't even able to get into the programs because there was an initial threshold that they weren't able to meet. And that was alarming to us because those programs were designed to be for people who maybe had not had educational attainment that was as high, or had limited literacy, or were experiencing homelessness. And our youth were not able to even get into those programs. So we were confused because we know that our youth are fierce and brilliant and are capable. So we had to find a way to do employment coaching differently. And what we started to notice was that because in our community and in many communities, there is a lot of exposure to trauma, that trauma was showing up in a way with employment readiness that was really hurting young people's ability to find jobs and to keep jobs. And so we had to start looking at how trauma was impacting young people's experiences, and more importantly, in our role in creating employment readiness, how do we make that a more trauma-informed approach? So we started looking at doing employment coaching in ways that integrated in planning ahead, problem solving, and memory. And those are all areas that persistent exposure to trauma impacts. And those were things that we were seeing showing up in a lot of the barriers that youth were experiencing to finding jobs. So for example, young people would know that being on time is considered late. You should try to be early to your job to really be successful. And young people would know how to take the bus. They would know how to get to where they were going. But then in the morning, a young person might realize that their work uniform is dirty and they only have one, and they don't know what to do, so they just don't go to work. And so we started to do employment coaching around real life examples of barriers that youth had experienced that kept them from getting jobs. And we would talk about that and really do problem solving exercises specific to that. We would talk about memory tactics. We would spend a lot of time finding ways that planning ahead worked for young people in their language in ways that were accessible to them. And then additionally, because we are an LGBTQ agency and most of our youth identify as LGBTQ, we would also talk with young people about employment coaching, being a queer person in Michigan, which means that you can legally be fired or not hired for being gay. And so we would talk to young people about doing cost-benefit analysis of decision-making on whether or not to come out in an interview, whether or not to come out at work, because that has to be that individual's decision. And it was really important that young people had the resources and space to think about that before they were applying to jobs, so that it wasn't something that snuck up on them and then ended up resulting in termination of employment. So I say all this to say that we had to find a way to do employment coaching differently. We had to look at what was working in other spaces and what youth were showing us they really needed, and also what their strengths were, because there were some things that they just inherently understood that we really didn't need to spend time focusing on, that other programs or other research might have prescribed that we spent more energy on. So we would, we did literature reviews, looked at what people were doing. We were able to integrate aspects of trauma-focused CBT, but not necessarily take it wholesale. It was always about catering it for the community, and then most importantly, being humble enough as an agency to try something and then really hear the negative feedback from people and say, okay, we need to do this differently. It has to be always a process of acting and reflecting and then being willing to change things.
Yeah. So you chose employment coaching as an evidence-based intervention for the youth, and yet on further reflection, you realized for our particular population, we're going to need to make some adjustments in order to make this work. Can you talk about the process of switching over towards a trauma-informed approach? I know you just mentioned that you've looked to literature reviews, or you've gone to the academic literature in order to try and inform that process. Can you talk about kind of the steps that you took to search the literature, identify different kind of articles or research, and how you appraised those as whether this would work for our youth or not?
Right. So, when we do literature reviews, we try to use a variety of sources, and then always make sure that we look pretty critically at where this information is coming from. Is there any kind of explicit bias from an institution? And while that sounds overly cautious, up until very recently and still today, there are folks who are publishing information that promotes, this idea that LGBTQ young people should be turned straight or heterosexual, and that those attitudes are still prevalent or might be woven into the undertones of an article. And so just because something is peer reviewed does not mean that it is also in line with our principles of work at the Ruth Ellis Center and how we do the work. And so we look at everything with a critical eye. Publication date is obviously important, and I think that looking at any kind of studies that happened and who they were done with. So a lot of times, currently most research that has been done that looks at work with LGBTQ youth is done with predominantly white, middle upper class LGBTQ youth. That doesn't mean the research is not relevant and that it is not important. And that means that there could be some very key differences in terms of the strengths and needs of the community that was researched compared to the community that we work with. So we are always thinking about an intersectional overlay to anything that we are reading. And the reality is right now that, again, there just isn't enough research that's very specific to LGBTQ youth of color who are out of home and who are experiencing a lot of systemic barriers to housing, health, and wellness. So we can't sometimes be too picky because we don't really have a lot of options. So we have to start with what we have and then start to look at adjustments because we're also not looking to reinvent the wheel. Right. So it's a balance between being critical and open at the same time, but always making sure that whatever it is that we are referencing is worthy of our time, because we do not, like a lot of small nonprofits, have time to spend on interventions that we know don't work. And more importantly, we have to be sure that whatever it is that we're utilizing is not harming the folks that we work with. And so getting input from our youth advisory board and our youth who are on staff about their feelings and also their thoughts, and then what they're really seeing from other young people and their experiences.
At the Ruth Ellis Center, do you have kind of traditional sources or constant sources that you go back to in order to identify literature? Can you talk us through your process of how you identify the various research studies that then you appraise in order to integrate?
Is this where I'm allowed to say graduate students? That we rely heavily on MSW students to do different literature reviews, and we use, kind of traditional search engines and look to a lot of the common journals, but we have keyword searches. And more importantly, those keyword searches are not just LGBTQ or just youth. We're really looking at best practices and what is working with young people of color. We look at best practices and what is working with youth experiencing homelessness, because all of these identities are a part of a young person's experience. And so the way that we look for information, again, has to have that intersectional overlay. But so it's typically a part of a graduate student's role to be doing at least once a month a search for anything that's new. Even something as simple as doing Google Alerts will alert us to new academic articles, or if there's been anything in the news, they'll often have links to articles as well. So we do kind of like the JSTOR, all of those kind of searches, but then we also do other alerts to make sure that we're connected to what Lambda Legal or the Williams Institute is doing, because those are extremely helpful resources as well.
Yes. So the Ruth Ellis Center is lucky in the sense that it has integrated master's students into its workflow. But I want you to think back to when you first started at the Ruth Ellis Center, and maybe we weren't as fortunate to have graduate students to do some of those searches for you. At that point, were you accessing and kind of integrating the literature, and how might you do that if you were a bit more resource limited, or if you didn't readily have access to some of those databases?
We would spend a lot of time at conferences and look at what people were presenting, and really working with other nonprofits and doing a lot of idea and research and resource sharing. So I think that also we only have so much time to read, so it's important to rely on a community of folks who have shared values and a shared approach to the work, who, are also looking out for what is working and are just hungry for that information and constantly whether you're at work or you're at drinks after work, having a conversation about what you're passionate about, finding people that have that excitement about the work and what is the how of the work, I think is really important. And so that was really key. And then also, just most importantly, just paying attention to what young people are saying and doing, right? Some of it is not as complicated as we like to think it is. I think that people want to have an extremely profound analysis that is backed by research, but a lot of the research that we're doing now is really to demonstrate things that if you spend time in the field, you feel like might already be quite evident. So I think that strategies around creating free, safe, and accessible space for young people who are not able to find that in other ways, and then that being the hook that gets young people into services is really key. And just paying attention to what works and what that looks like. And then we also did some early projects that were participatory research, where we were doing youth storytelling and qualitative coding of young people's experiences. The first project that we did that with was specific to LGBTQ youth in Detroit Public Schools, talking about their experiences, and that information was used to change the Detroit Public School anti-bullying and harassment policy. So I think that even if you don't have a graduate student to, get on all of these academic search engines and do literature reviews, that there are ways to find access to those ideas and make sure that you're really listening. And a lot of times I think that people are concerned that they don't have time for that. And I certainly can relate to that feeling. And I think that ultimately knowing that upfront investment and that listening throughout services is at the end of the day actually going to save you time, because it's going to make services more effective. And I think that it's also going to make the work more sustainable, because folks who are accessing services are going to feel better about it and more invested. And ultimately, I think that for many of us, having a deep sense of why and how we do the work is important at the end of the day, because social work at a face value is, of course, a worthy cause, but there's a lot of burnout and it can be really hard work. And I think finding ways to engage our minds and our hearts on different levels that are more systemic, and thinking about the macro impacts of the day-to-day can also feed what drives us to do the work in the first place.
Yeah. I want to circle back real quick to the clearinghouses, the national clearinghouses that you mentioned. Mm-hmm. Could you say a bit more about whether those were helpful for the Ruth Ellis Center, if that might be a feasible way to access research for those folks who don't have access to standard academic databases? Absolutely.
So we are members of a lot of national clearinghouses and national technical assistance groups. So some of those are free. Some of them, there's a smaller fee or annual fee. But what that gives you access to are free webinars, which are also resources that people who are at conferences that you went to are accessing. Mm-hmm. So there's ongoing idea sharing that is, again, not just in your immediate community, but nationally, which I think is really important to be getting different perspectives on what's working and thinking about a problem that has been ongoing within your work differently through different lenses. We also, a lot of the clearinghouses or national groups will have monthly newsletters with links to academic articles, or they'll interview practitioners, just in the same way we're having a conversation right now about, right. Well, you're a social worker on the ground day to day. What do you do? What do you feel like works? What recommendations would you make to other people? And while that's anecdotal, I think it's still important to continue to build this sense of community around the discomfort of not knowing it all, not having all the answers, and that being okay as long as we're committed to continuing to try to figure it out. And that's not a comfortable space for some people,
Right.
and that probably means social work isn't a good fit for them. But I think that that to me, that's the work, and that's really an important part of it.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm very appreciative that you've kind of shared your wisdom with us as an evidence-based practitioner. Any final thoughts or any final strategies you might like to share with folks about how you've integrated this into your practice?
So the Ruth Ellis Center is working with the state of Michigan to do work with families who have children who identify as LGBTQ. And we entered that work with a partnership with the Family Acceptance Project, who's done a majority of the research on how parental rejecting and accepting behaviors toward their LGBTQ youth have an impact on their health and safety outcomes. And so when we approached working with the state of Michigan, we were kind of straddling two worlds of this research approach that we knew was really important, that we wanted to overlay into the work, and then the work that the state of Michigan is doing to protect children and keep families together. That's pretty institutionalized and straightforward. In our role at the Ruth Ellis Center, we see it as really finding ways to do work that is embedded in the systems that already exist, that are already funded to help protect and serve children and families, while also finding ways to, with those systems, through listening to those systems, bring the voice of young people that have been invisible, that have not been fully served by those systems that are meant to protect them. And so we have our feet in kind of two different worlds, and we're straddling all of that work. But I think that that has been one of the most important projects that we've done, because we've been able to work with young people who previously, the LGBTQ community, we would have said, oh, well, we should just pull them from the house. Their parents don't love them because they're gay, which is a kind of easy narrative, but a problematic one. And mostly because we know through social work research, not specific to the LGBTQ community, but in general, that families are critical to a young person's well-being. And even if it's not safe for a young person to live with their family, for them to still find ways to build safe connections with them is important. And so we had to go back to that and do some healing as LGBTQ people ourselves and say, I think that we have to really re-examine how we're working with families. So the state of Michigan was extremely supportive in us plugging into their family preservation work, which was about identifying families where a young person might be at risk of being removed because of abuse and neglect, but that the state determined the child could stay at home as long as the family got additional services. So the Ruth Ellis Center was able to be one of the agencies that provides those additional services. And we did that through the Family Acceptance Project's approach. That is a body of research that's really looked at the experience of LGBTQ youth with their parents and how the parent behaviors impact that child's health and safety outcomes. So I say all this to say that I think that it's easy to want to avoid systems of care that already exist, that we don't see serving communities that we're trying to work with, and looking at research that has helped and has been good for that community, and try to create a separate space. But at the end of the day, that often results in a situation where that work is not replicable, or it's not actually going to reach some of the most vulnerable young people that we're trying to work with. And so I think the other thing that we've really been learning at Ruth Ellis Center is the importance of embedded system change by applying research within systems of care that already exist, that are already in these communities that we hope to work with, and that we can learn from those systems of care and really kind of embed ourselves in ways that it's not disruptive, but we can learn from them, while also not being afraid to challenge some of the practices that we know are harmful to communities that have been invisible in the past. So that work has been extremely important, and I think is exciting in terms of what we're doing at the Ruth Ellis Center.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you again for sharing both your experience and your practice wisdom with us. And we hope that this has been a useful and helpful example of how the integration of evidence in the field plays out within the real world.